The smartest people in the room are the hardest to fool. That's what you think, right? A guy with a degree from a top university, a woman who's published 40 papers, a fellow who can do triple integrals in his head. You'd think these people would be almost impossible to deceive. You'd think they'd spot the trick, see through the nonsense, sniff out the fraud in about 3 seconds flat. And you would be completely, totally, spectacularly wrong. In fact, I'm going to show you that it's the opposite. The smarter you are, the easier it is to fool you. And I don't mean a little easier, I mean dangerously easier. The reason why is one of the most important things I've ever learned about the way science really works. And it comes down to a single sentence that I think every person on Earth ought to hear at least once. But first, let me start with something that sounds perfectly reasonable. Intelligence is a kind of protection, right? If you're clever, you can see patterns, you can detect inconsistencies, you can reason your way through a problem while other people are still trying to figure out what the problem is. A sharp mind is like a good immune system for bad ideas. That's the picture most people carry around, and it's a very flattering picture, especially if you happen to think you're pretty sharp yourself. So you walk around feeling safe. I'm not the kind of person who falls for that stuff. You've got your diploma on the wall, you've read the right books, you can tell the difference between a real argument and a phony one. You feel vaccinated against nonsense, bulletproof. And to be fair, there are plenty of examples where intelligence seems to work exactly that way. You see an advertisement that says some pill will make you lose 30 pounds in a week, and you laugh. Somebody tells you they've invented a machine that produces more energy than you put in, runs forever, never needs fuel, and you know that violates thermodynamics, so you wave your hand and move on. You can spot those frauds, the obvious ones, the ones that are designed to catch people who haven't thought very carefully about how the world works. But I want you to notice something. Those aren't the dangerous ones. Nobody ever wrecked a field of science with a perpetual motion machine. The dangerous nonsense, the kind that actually does real damage, the kind that wastes decades of research and millions of dollars and leads people down blind alleys, it doesn't look like nonsense at all. It looks like science. It sounds like science. It wears a lab coat. It's got equations and data and published papers and peer review and conferences and keynote speakers. It's got very smart people standing behind it, people with better degrees than you, from better universities than you attended, with longer publication lists than you'll ever have. And that's exactly where the trouble begins. Let me tell you a story. There was a man named René Blondlot, a French physicist working in the city of Nancy around 1903. Not a crank, not a fool, not some guy tinkering in his garage. This was a legitimate, respected, accomplished scientist. He had done fine work on electromagnetic waves. He was a member of the French Academy of Sciences. People took him seriously because he had earned it. And Blondlot announced, with great confidence and considerable evidence, that he had discovered a new kind of radiation. He called it N-rays, after the city of Nancy where he worked. He said these rays were emitted by all sorts of sources, metals, heated objects, even the human nervous system. He said they could be refracted through an aluminum prism, and the way you detected them was subtle. You looked at a dim electric spark through a thread of calcium sulfide, and when the N-rays fell upon it, the spark got just a tiny bit brighter. Not a lot. You had to look carefully. You had to have a trained eye. But it was there. He was sure. And here's what happened next, and this is the part that really matters. Within months, other scientists started confirming his results. Not one or two, dozens of them, many of them highly respected. They published their confirmations in serious journals. The Comptes Rendus, the main publication of the French Academy of Sciences, was printing N-ray papers one after another. By the time the dust settled, nearly 100 scientific papers had been published on N-rays in a single year. Think about what that means. That's 100 separate groups of intelligent, trained people working in their own laboratories, seeing something, measuring something, reporting something, and all of them confirming each other. It looked like an open and shut case. A new form of radiation had been discovered, another triumph for French physics. There was just one small detail. N-rays did not exist. There was nothing there. The entire phenomenon was an illusion, a collective hallucination, dressed up in laboratory apparatus. And the way it was exposed is one of my favorite stories in all of science. An American physicist named Robert Wood went to visit Blondlot's laboratory in Nancy. Wood was a clever experimentalist, and he was skeptical about these N-rays. He noticed that the whole demonstration relied on subjective judgment. You had to stare at a dim spark and decide whether it got slightly brighter. There was no objective measurement, no meter, no counter, no photograph, just your eyes and your opinion. So during one of Blondlot's demonstrations, while the room was dark and Blondlot was pointing out how the N-rays were refracting through his aluminum prism and brightening the spark, Wood did something simple and devastating. He quietly reached over and removed the aluminum prism from the apparatus, just picked it up and put it in his pocket. If the N-rays were real and the prism was refracting them, then removing the prism should have changed the results completely. It should have been obvious. Blondlot noticed nothing. He kept right on reporting changes in the brightness of the spark, changes that could not possibly be happening because the key piece of equipment was sitting in Wood's coat. The whole thing was self-deception. From the very beginning, Blondlot and all those other scientists had been seeing what they wanted to see, not what was there. Now, you might be tempted to feel superior. You might think, well, that was 1903. We're much more sophisticated now. Our instruments are better. Our methods are more rigorous. Our statistical techniques are more powerful. And all of that is true. But the fundamental problem has not changed by 1 inch, because the fundamental problem isn't about instruments or statistics. It's about the thing sitting between your ears. It's about what happens inside the human mind when it wants something to be true. Let me show you what I mean with another example, this one a little closer to modern science. There was a beautiful experiment done by Robert Millikan, the oil drop experiment, measuring the charge of the electron. Very famous. Millikan won the Nobel Prize partly on the strength of this work, and he got a number for the charge of the electron, a specific number, but it was a little bit wrong, a little bit too low. The reason was that he had used a slightly incorrect value for the viscosity of air in his calculations. Not a big error, not a scandal, just a small systematic mistake that pushed his answer slightly off. But here is the thing that fascinated me. If you look at the historical record of electron charge measurements after Millikan, something strange happens. You don't see people immediately jumping to the correct value. What you see is a slow, gradual drift. The next measurement was a little bit higher than Millikan's. The one after that, a little higher still, creeping upward year by year toward the value we now accept. A nice, gentle slope. Why? Because when a physicist got a number that was far from Millikan's published result, they assumed they had made an error. They'd go back and look for mistakes. They'd fiddle with the equipment, adjust the procedure, try again. They'd keep adjusting until they got something in the right neighborhood, something that didn't embarrass them by being too far from the accepted value. But when they got a number close to Millikan's, they said, "Good, that looks about right," and they stopped checking. They stopped looking for errors. You see what happened? The previous result was acting as an anchor. It was telling each experimenter when to be satisfied and when to keep worrying. And nobody was doing this on purpose. Nobody was cheating. They just had an unconscious rule. Results that agree with the master are probably right, and results that disagree are probably mistakes. But that rule, applied systematically, means you can never discover that the master was wrong. You've built the error into the system. You've locked the door and swallowed the key. And this right here is the kind of thing that happens when smart people do science without the right kind of honesty. Not dishonesty, not fraud, something much subtler and much more common. The quiet decision about when to stop looking for errors. The invisible hand that pushes your results toward what you expect. It's happening in laboratories all over the world, right now, today, and the people doing it have no idea they're doing it. Let me tell you about another example, because I think you need to see the pattern before you'll believe me. There's a phenomenon in psychology and medicine and all sorts of fields where you test whether something has an effect on people. Say you've got a new drug, and you want to know if it works. So you give it to some people, and you give a sugar pill to other people, and you compare. Standard stuff. Clinical trial. Very well-established method. But here's the problem. You run your trial, you collect your data, and you've got 30 different measurements. Blood pressure, heart rate, cholesterol, mood, sleep quality, reaction time, and on. 30 different things. And when you analyze them all, 28 of them show no difference between the drug and the sugar pill. But 2 of them, let's say cholesterol and sleep quality, show a statistically significant effect. So what do you publish? You publish a paper titled, "New Drug Improves Cholesterol and Sleep Quality." You don't mention the other 28 things you measured. Why would you? They didn't show anything interesting. But wait a minute, think about what statistics actually tells you. If you're using the standard threshold, which is a 5% chance of a false positive, and you measure 30 things, you should expect about 1.5 of those to show a significant effect purely by chance, by accident, just from the random noise in your data. So finding 2 out of 30 is exactly what you'd expect even if the drug does absolutely nothing. The 2 significant results might be meaningless. They might be ghosts, artifacts of looking at too many things at once. And the researcher who publishes those 2 results is not lying. They ran a real experiment. They used proper statistics on each individual measurement. Everything looks legitimate. But they've committed what amounts to a subtle fraud because they didn't tell you about the 28 things that didn't work. They let you think they had a specific prediction. This drug will improve cholesterol and sleep, when actually they had no prediction at all. They threw darts at a wall and drew the bullseye afterward. This happens constantly. It has a name. People call it the file drawer problem because the negative results, the ones that show no effect, go into a file drawer and never see the light of day. And the result is that the published scientific literature, the body of knowledge that doctors and policymakers and teachers rely on, is systematically biased toward positive findings. It's like reading a book where all the chapters about failure have been ripped out. You get a wildly distorted picture of what's actually true. And I keep coming back to the same point. The people doing this are not idiots. They are not crooks. They are smart, hard-working, well-intentioned scientists who are caught in a system that rewards them for finding things and punishes them for not finding things. The incentives are all wrong. But that doesn't excuse the behavior, because the first duty of a scientist is not to their career. It's not to their grant agency. It's not to the journal editors. It's to the truth. And if the truth is that your drug doesn't work, then saying so is the most important thing you can do, more important than any positive result you could ever publish. So let me ask you a question. What is the difference between a scientist and a person who merely goes through the motions of being a scientist? You might say knowledge, you might say method, you might say training, you might say talent. But I say it's none of those things. I say the difference is a particular kind of honesty that most people, even most very intelligent people, find almost impossibly hard to sustain. I gave a talk once at Caltech, 1974. It was the commencement address, graduation day, caps and gowns and proud parents. And I decided to talk about something I called cargo cult science. You know what a cargo cult is? During the Second World War, there were islands in the South Pacific where the native people had watched American military airplanes land on airstrips. The planes brought cargo, wonderful things, canned food, tools, medicine, all sorts of goods that came from the sky like magic. Then the war ended. The soldiers left. The planes stopped coming, and the cargo stopped, so the islanders wanted it back, and they did something perfectly logical from their point of view. They recreated everything they had observed. They cleared strips of land to look like runways. They built little wooden huts that looked like control towers. They carved headphones out of coconut shells and wore them on their heads. They lit signal fires along the sides of the landing strips. They stationed a man in the hut with bamboo sticks on his ears, moving his hands the way they had seen the air traffic controllers do. Everything looked right. From a distance, you could almost believe you were looking at a real airport. They had reproduced every visible detail. But the planes did not land, because they had copied the form without understanding the substance. They had all the parts that looked like an airport, but they were missing the invisible thing that made it work. And I told those graduating students at Caltech that a lot of what passes for science in the modern world is exactly like a cargo cult. It has the form of science. It looks like science. There are laboratories and experiments and data and statistical tests and published papers and citations and review committees, all the visible apparatus of scientific inquiry. But in many cases, the essential thing is missing, the invisible thing, the thing you can't see from the outside. And what is that thing? I call it scientific integrity. But I don't mean integrity in the ordinary sense, like not stealing or not lying. I mean something much more specific and much harder. I mean the habit, the discipline, the practice of bending over backwards to show how you might be wrong. Not how you're right, how you might be wrong. See, if you're doing an experiment and you know there are possible sources of error, you have a duty to think about every single one of them, not just the ones that are convenient to think about, not just the ones you know how to fix, all of them, even the ones you'd rather ignore, especially the ones you'd rather ignore. And you have a duty to report them openly in your paper so that other people can judge for themselves how much to trust your result. This is the thing that smart people are worst at, because a smart person can always think of a reason to dismiss the inconvenient data. Oh, that measurement was probably contaminated. That subject was obviously an outlier. Those conditions weren't quite right, so we can set that trial aside. And each of those excuses might even be true, but if you only apply that level of scrutiny to the data that goes against your theory and never to the data that supports it, then you're not doing science. You've got the wooden headphones and the coconut radio. You've got every part of the airport except the part that makes the planes come. Let me give you a specific example of what real integrity looks like, because I think we need more models of this. There was a man named Young, a researcher who did experiments on rats in mazes. He was trying to figure out how rats navigate. What information are they actually using? Is it the smell of the food? Is it the color of the walls? Is it the pattern of light? He was a careful man, and he started eliminating cues one at a time. And what he discovered was remarkable. He found that rats are fantastically sensitive to cues that experimenters didn't even realize were there. The sounds the floor makes when the rat walks on it. Tiny differences in smell from one arm of the maze to another. Vibrations in the building. Changes in air current. The rat was picking up on things that the experimenter had never thought to control for. And if you didn't control for these things, your results were meaningless. You thought you were studying learning, but you were actually studying the rat's ability to notice which floorboard squeaked differently. This was an incredibly important finding. It meant that a large number of published rat experiments done by serious researchers at serious universities and published in serious journals were unreliable. Their conclusions might be completely wrong because they hadn't controlled for cues they didn't know existed. Did the rest of the psychology community adopt Young's controls? Did they start building their mazes more carefully? They did not. His papers were published, read, and quietly ignored, not because anyone could find a flaw in his work. His work was meticulous, but because taking it seriously would have meant admitting that a lot of previous work was questionable. It would have meant going back and redoing experiments. It would have been expensive and inconvenient and embarrassing. So the field just stepped around it like walking around a puddle and kept doing things the old way. And that tells you something important about the real enemy of good science. The enemy is not stupidity. A stupid mistake can be found and fixed. The enemy is not malice. Deliberate fraud is rare and usually gets caught eventually. The real enemy is something much more common and much harder to fight. The real enemy is convenience, the desire to get a publishable result without too much trouble, the desire to confirm what you already believe without the tedious work of trying to disprove it, the desire to not go back and redo the work you've already done, because that would mean admitting the first round might have been wrong. Smart people feel all of these desires. They feel them just as strongly as anyone else. Sometimes more strongly, because they've invested more in their ideas. A graduate student who has spent 4 years on a thesis has an enormous emotional and practical investment in the thesis being correct. Telling that student, your result might be an artifact of an uncontrolled variable, is not just an intellectual challenge, it's an existential threat. And the smarter the student is, the better they are at constructing reasons why the uncomfortable criticism doesn't apply. So intelligence, instead of being your shield against bad ideas, becomes your sword for defending them. The brain power that should have been used to question the idea gets diverted to protecting the idea. Every objection is met with a clever rebuttal. Every inconvenient data point is explained away with a plausible excuse. The fortress gets taller and stronger and more impressive looking, and the person inside the fortress feels more and more certain they're right, and they are further and further from the truth. I think this is one of the most frightening things about human nature. And I say that as a person who has spent a lot of time thinking about nature, both human and otherwise. So now let me get to the heart of it. If intelligence doesn't protect you, and education doesn't protect you, and credentials don't protect you, what does? What is the rule? What is the one principle that separates real science from the cargo cult imitation? I'll put it as simply as I can. The first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. That's the whole thing, that one sentence. Everything else follows from it. You are the easiest person to fool, not because you're stupid, not because you're corrupt, but because you are the only person with access to the inside of your own mind. You know what you want the answer to be. You know which result would get you the promotion, the grant, the publication, the applause. You know which interpretation fits nicely with the work you've already done and the reputation you've already built. Other people can only see your external argument. If there's a flaw, they might catch it. But you can smooth over flaws before they become visible to anyone, including yourself. You can adjust your reasoning in real time, below the level of conscious awareness, so that everything comes out the way you want. And the terrifying part is that you don't even know you're doing it. So what do you do about it? How do you fight an enemy that lives inside your own head? I'll tell you what doesn't work first. Trusting your own judgment doesn't work. That's using the corrupted instrument to check itself. Feeling confident doesn't work, because confidence is a sensation, not evidence. Being smart doesn't work, as we've been discussing for the last 20 minutes. Having a degree doesn't work. Having a famous advisor doesn't work. Being published doesn't work. None of the things we normally rely on to tell us we're on the right track actually protect us from this particular kind of error. What does work is discipline, a set of habits that you practice deliberately over and over until they become part of how you think. And I should warn you, most of these habits feel awful. They go against every natural instinct. The first habit is this: when you get a result you like, that is when you should become most suspicious, not when you get a result you dislike. Think about it. When a result surprises you, when it contradicts your expectations, when it makes you scratch your head and say, "That's weird," that is probably the most honest moment in the experiment. You had no motivation to manufacture that result. It came to you unbidden. But when the data lines up perfectly with your prediction, when the graph looks exactly like you drew it on the napkin last week, that is the time to get nervous. That is the time to check the apparatus again, run the controls again, hand the data to someone who doesn't know what you expected and see if they read it the same way. Because the universe, in my experience, is not in the habit of confirming our theories so neatly. When it seems to be doing that, ask yourself, am I seeing the universe or am I seeing myself? The second habit is to report everything, all the measurements, not just the ones that worked. If you ran an experiment 10 times and got a clear result 7 times and a confused result 3 times, you do not publish only the 7. You report all 10, and you try to understand the 3. Maybe there's a good reason. Maybe the equipment glitched. Maybe there was a contamination you can identify. But maybe, just maybe, those 3 failures are the most important data you've got. Maybe they're trying to tell you something, and if you throw them away, you'll never hear the message. I have seen too many published papers in reputable journals where the authors quietly dropped the data points that didn't fit. They didn't fabricate anything. They didn't invent numbers. They just selected. They chose which results to show and which to hide. And this selective reporting is one of the most pervasive and corrosive forms of dishonesty in all of science, because it looks perfectly reasonable. Every individual decision to exclude a data point has a plausible justification, but the cumulative effect is a literature full of results that look much cleaner and more convincing than they really are. The third habit is the hardest of all. You must think of every way your result might be wrong, and you must report those ways honestly, in public, in your paper, where everyone can see them, not buried in a footnote, not hidden in the supplementary material, right there in the main text. Our result could be explained by this alternative mechanism, which we have not been able to rule out. Our sample was biased in this way, which might affect the conclusion. Our statistical test assumes this condition, and we're not certain the condition holds. You know what this feels like? It feels like sabotaging your own work. Every sentence you write about a possible weakness is a sentence that some reviewer might use to reject your paper, that some competitor might use to dismiss your finding, that some journalist might use to say your research doesn't prove anything. So the incentive structure in modern science pushes you to minimize your weaknesses and emphasize your strengths, to act like a lawyer presenting a case rather than a scientist presenting evidence. But a lawyer and a scientist have opposite jobs. A lawyer's job is to be persuasive regardless of the truth. A scientist's job is to present the truth regardless of persuasion. If you find yourself being persuasive, if you're crafting your argument to be maximally convincing, stop. Ask yourself what you left out. Ask yourself what you soft-pedaled. Ask yourself what's in the filing cabinet that didn't make it into the paper. Let me push this even deeper, because there's a layer underneath all of this that I think most people miss entirely. Why do smart people fall for fake science? It's not just self-deception. It's not just career pressure, though. Heaven knows there's plenty of that. There's something more fundamental. It's about the relationship between intelligence and certainty. A smart person is accustomed to being right. Think about it. From the time they're a child, in school, They get the right answers. They win the spelling bees and the math competitions. They solve problems that stump their classmates. They develop a kind of internal confidence, a feeling in the gut that says, I can figure things out. And that feeling is mostly accurate. It served them well for years. It got them into good schools and good jobs and good laboratories. It's a useful feeling. But it has a terrible side effect. It makes you trust your own reasoning more than the evidence warrants. Here is what I mean. An ordinary person, when they encounter something they don't understand, says, I don't understand it. A smart person does something different. They construct an explanation. They use their formidable reasoning ability to fill in the gaps. And because the explanation they construct is clever, internally consistent, and logically tight, they believe it. They mistake the quality of the argument for the quality of the evidence. I'll give you an analogy from a completely different world. Think about a carpenter. A very skilled carpenter, the best in town, can build you a cabinet that looks perfect. Every joint tight, every surface smooth, every angle square. Beautiful work. But if the wood is rotten, it doesn't matter how skilled the carpenter is. The cabinet will fall apart. The quality of the craftsmanship cannot compensate for the quality of the material. An argument is like the carpentry. Evidence is like the wood. You can craft the most perfect argument ever assembled by a human mind, fit together with absolute logical precision. And if the evidence underneath is weak or ambiguous or selected to flatter your theory, the whole thing is built on rot. It will not hold. And here's the trap. Good carpentry hides rotten wood. A beautiful argument conceals weak evidence. The better you are at reasoning, the harder it is for anyone, including you, to see the weakness underneath. A clumsy argument built on strong evidence is actually more trustworthy than an elegant argument built on shaky evidence. But our brains don't work that way. Our brains are dazzled by elegance. We reward the quality of the argument because that's what we can see. The evidence is buried. The evidence is hard to evaluate. The argument is right there in front of you, shining and impressive. So we trust the shine. The argument sounds brilliant. It must be correct, but nature does not give a damn about the quality of your argument. Nature is not sitting there grading your logic on a scale of 1 to 10. Nature only responds to experiments. You can construct the most beautiful, elegant, airtight theoretical argument ever built by a human mind, and nature can turn around and say no. And when that happens, nature is right and you are wrong every single time, no matter how smart you are. I have seen this. I have seen a brilliant physicist with an elegant theory, a theory of breathtaking mathematical beauty, and the theory was wrong, and the physicist couldn't see it, because the theory was so beautiful that it had become the physicist's child, its creator, its defender, and every experimental result that contradicted the theory was met not with curiosity, but with a new argument for why the experiment must have been flawed. Not new evidence, new arguments. Arguments are cheap. You can produce them endlessly, especially if you're clever. Evidence is expensive. It takes time and money and sweat and humility. And that asymmetry, the ease of constructing arguments versus the difficulty of gathering evidence, that asymmetry is what kills good science. You want to know what a real scientist looks like? A real scientist takes more pleasure in finding out they were wrong than in finding out they were right. I know that sounds perverse. Every instinct tells you to celebrate when you're right and grieve when you're wrong. But think about it carefully. If you're right, you haven't learned anything. You're exactly where you started. The world is just as you thought it was. But if you're wrong, and you discover you're wrong, now you know something new, something real, something the universe just handed you for free. The moments in my own work that taught me the most were not the triumphs. They were the confusions. The times I said, wait a minute, that can't be right, and went back and found the error and followed it somewhere I didn't expect to go. This connects to something even bigger. It's not just about individual scientists and their individual experiments. It's about how we, as a whole civilization, think about knowledge and expertise. People love experts. They love the idea that somewhere out there is a person who knows. Capital K, a person who has the answer. And when that person stands up in a white coat from a famous institution with an impressive title and says, this is how it is, most people believe them. Not because they've examined the evidence, not because they've read the papers and checked the math and looked at the error bars, because they've evaluated the credentials. They've looked at the packaging and decided it's probably fine inside. But credentials are not evidence. A degree from a fine university tells you that a person studied hard and passed some tests. It tells you nothing, absolutely nothing, about whether the specific claim they are making, right here, right now, today, is correct. A Nobel Prize winner can be wrong about something outside their field. A Nobel Prize winner can be wrong about something inside their field. Authority is not a method of determining truth. It's a shortcut we use because we don't have time to check everything ourselves, and it's a useful shortcut, but it's a shortcut that breaks down at the exact moment when it matters most, which is when the authority is mistaken. I remember being asked to serve on a committee evaluating science textbooks for the state of California. And I read these books. I read all of them. I spent weeks on it, going through every chapter, every example, every exercise, and some of them were atrocious, absolutely terrible. There were definitions that were wrong, explanations that were backwards, exercises that couldn't be solved with the information given. In one book, the pictures were just decorations. They had no connection to the text. There was a photograph of a winding machine in a shoe factory with no explanation of what it had to do with anything, and a caption that said, "Energy makes things go." That was the level. Energy makes things go. You could say that about literally anything. A horse makes things go. A river makes things go. Pushing makes things go. It tells you nothing. But here is what really disturbed me. I was on that committee, and I was the only person who had actually read the books. The other committee members had not read them. They couldn't have because some of the books hadn't even been finished yet. They were evaluating books that were still being printed. They were rating them based on descriptions and tables of contents and sample chapters. And some of the committee members had conflicts of interest. They were connected to the publishers. The whole process was designed not to find the best textbooks, but to distribute the business of textbook adoption among the various publishers. And if the actual science happened to be correct, well, that was a bonus, but not a requirement. And when I looked at who had written and approved these books, it was people with impressive titles, professors and administrators and curriculum specialists, people whose job it was to know about science education. The whole system was set up to evaluate the books on everything except whether the content was correct. They checked the format, the layout, the inclusion of the right topics in the right order, whether the books met state standards. Nobody checked whether the sentences were true. It was cargo cult education. It looked like a science textbook. It had the chapters and the glossary and the review questions, but the substance, the actual science, was missing or mangled. And nobody noticed because everybody was looking at the form. I'll tell you what this taught me. It taught me that expertise without verification is just decoration. A title on a book cover does not make the contents right. A committee of impressive people does not produce an impressive result if none of them are actually checking the work. The entire apparatus of credentials and committees and review processes can function perfectly, every box checked, every procedure followed, and still produce something that is fundamentally, embarrassingly, laughably wrong. Because nobody asked the only question that matters. Is this true? This happens whenever a system rewards credentials more than results. Whenever the question is, who said it? Instead of, is it actually true? You've built a machine for generating confident, authoritative, well-credentialed nonsense. So is it hopeless? Is there nothing to be done? Are we permanently stuck in the cargo cult? No, but the solution is not what most people guess. Most people think the answer is more intelligence, more education, better schools, better critical thinking courses, and those things can help. I'm not against education, obviously, but they are not sufficient. Because as I've been explaining, intelligence can be turned against itself. The smarter the person, the better they are at fooling themselves if they haven't learned the one thing that actually matters. The solution is doubt. Not the paralyzing doubt that makes you afraid to think at all. Not the cynical doubt that says nothing can ever be known. The productive doubt. The scientific doubt. The kind that says I have an idea and it might be right and it might be wrong, so let me check. The kind that treats your own ideas with exactly the same healthy suspicion you would apply to somebody else's ideas. Let me be very precise about what I mean, because doubt is a word that gets misused. I don't mean you should walk around in a fog, unable to decide anything, paralyzed by the possibility that everything might be wrong. That's not science. That's just anxiety. The kind of doubt I'm talking about is active, not passive. It's a tool, not a mood. You take your best idea, the one you think is most likely right, and you try to break it. You design the experiment that would show it's wrong if it's wrong. And then you actually do that experiment. You don't just imagine it, you do it. And if the idea survives, great. Now you can hold it with a little more confidence, but you hold it loosely, always ready to drop it if new evidence comes along. This is what distinguishes science from everything else humans do. Not the equipment, not the math, not the jargon. The willingness to try to destroy your own ideas. Every other human enterprise, law, politics, business, religion, is built on advocacy. You pick a position and you argue for it. Science is supposed to be built on the opposite principle. You pick a position and you argue against it. And if it survives your best attack, then maybe, just maybe, it's telling you something about how the world actually works. You know what I have noticed about the best scientists I've ever been around? Every single one of them had this quality. They were uncomfortable with their own conclusions. Not miserable, not paralyzed, but uncomfortable. They had a little nagging voice in the back of their head that said, "What am I missing?" And instead of trying to silence that voice, the way most people do, they listened to it, they followed it. It led them to better experiments, tighter controls, deeper understanding. And they were not embarrassed by uncertainty. This is a big one. In our culture, uncertainty is treated as a weakness. If you say, "I don't know," in a meeting, people look at you like you've just admitted to a crime. But in science, "I don't know" is where all the interesting work begins. The person who says, "I know," has stopped investigating. They've closed the book. They're done. The person who says, "I don't know," is still looking. And the one who is still looking is the one who is going to find something. I worry about this. I worry about a world that wants certainty above all. People want quick answers. They want someone confident to tell them what is true, so they can relax and go back to their lives. And there is no shortage of people willing to play that role, willing to stand at a podium and say, "I have the answer, trust me." And the more confident they sound, the more people believe them. But confidence is a personality trait. It is not a measurement of truth. Some of the most confident speakers I have ever heard were dead wrong, and some of the most hesitant, uncertain, careful people were magnificently right. You can never, ever use the confidence of the speaker as evidence for the correctness of the claim. Never. Let me tie this all together. The rule, the brutal rule that I keep coming back to, that I've built my whole approach to science around, is this: you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. After you've learned not to fool yourself, everything else is comparatively easy. Being honest with other scientists is easy. Reporting your results accurately is easy. Admitting your mistakes is easy. Those are just habits of communication. The hard part, the part that takes a lifetime of practice and vigilance and courage, is the internal part. The part where you look at your own beautiful theory and say, "What if I'm wrong?" The part where you take the result you've been praying for and say, "Let me try to destroy it before I publish it." The part where you lean over so far backwards that you sometimes fall over. And this is not a rule about intelligence. That is the key point I want to leave you with. This is a rule about character. You do not need to be a genius to follow it. You need to be brave. You need to be willing to look at your own work with cold eyes and ask, "Is this really what happened? Or is this what I wanted to happen?" You need to be willing to throw out a result you spent months collecting if you discover that it was contaminated by a bias you didn't notice. You need to be willing to stand up in front of your colleagues, the people who fund you, the people who hired you, and say, "I was wrong. Here's what I think actually happened." That takes guts, real guts. And it takes a kind of humility that is not the same thing as self-doubt or timidity. It's the humility to recognize that you are a human being with the same biases and blind spots and tendencies toward wishful thinking that every human being has ever had, and that your fancy degree and your impressive title and your big brain do not exempt you from any of it, not one bit. The next time somebody presents you with a scientific claim, or any claim at all, I want you to resist the urge to ask, "Is this person smart?" Resist the urge to ask, "What are their credentials?" Resist the urge to ask, "Does this argument sound convincing?" Because smart people can be wrong. Credentials don't determine truth, and a convincing argument can be convincingly wrong. Instead, ask this: did they try to prove themselves wrong? Did they go looking for the errors? Did they report the things that didn't work along with the things that did? Did they consider the alternative explanations and tell you about them honestly? Did they lean over backwards? Because if they didn't do those things, then all the intelligence in the world cannot save them. They've got the bamboo antenna and the coconut headphones and the fires burning along the dirt runway. They've got everything that looks like science, everything except the part that makes it work. And the planes are not going to land. They never will. If you walked out of here tonight and somebody asked you, "What was that talk about?" I'd want you to be able to say one sentence, just one. He said the first principle of science is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. If you can remember that sentence, and if you take it seriously, And if you apply it to yourself before you apply it to anyone else, you'll have something more valuable than any diploma on any wall. You'll have the beginning of real scientific thinking. So tell me, think about your own life, whatever it is you do, whether it's science or business or teaching or raising children or anything at all. Where are you most likely fooling yourself right now? What's the belief you hold most comfortably, the one that feels so obviously true you've never once tried to test it? That's the one. That's where I'd start looking. That's the one that deserves a second look. And if you find out it was right all along, fine. You haven't lost anything. You've just strengthened your understanding of something true. But if you find out it was wrong, if the floor drops out from under you and you're left standing there with nothing but confusion and a bunch of questions you don't know how to answer, then congratulations. You've just done the bravest thing a thinking person can do. You've put the truth ahead of your comfort, and you're standing, for maybe the first time, on solid ground.